first rain of the evening came softly, almost like a whisper from heaven. It did not rush against the rooftops or strike the earth with any hurry. It simply arrived, drop by drop, resting on the old wooden fences, the little garden stones, the sloping cottage roofs, and the narrow village path that curved gently toward the small white church at the center of the valley. The village was quiet at this hour, tucked between green hills and fields of soft grass, where sheep had already gathered close beneath the shelter of low trees, and where the last golden light of day was slowly fading behind a veil of gray clouds. The rain seemed to bless everything it touched, washing the dust from the leaves, cooling the warm earth, and bringing with it the peaceful scent of soil, wood smoke, and wildflowers bending beneath the gentle evening air. In one small cottage near the edge of the village lived a humble man named Thomas. He was not a wealthy man, nor was he known for anything grand. He kept a small garden, repaired wooden chairs and tables for his neighbors, and helped ring the church bell on Sunday mornings when the old bell rope needed a strong and careful hand. His life was simple, and most days passed quietly, like a slow stream moving through a meadow. Yet Thomas had learned to see the kindness of God in small things, in a loaf of bread cooling near the window, in a kind word from a neighbor, in the glow of a candle after sunset, and in the faithful return of rain when the fields were thirsty. That evening, Thomas stood beneath the small roof beside his cottage door, holding a wooden pail in one hand and watching the rain fall across his little garden. The beans climbed their poles with fresh green leaves. The rosemary gave off a clean and gentle fragrance, and the lavender bowed softly under the water's touch. A few chickens had already settled inside their coop, making quiet, sleepy sounds as the sky grew darker. Beyond the garden, he could see the church steeple rising above the mist, its small cross still visible against the pale evening clouds. There was something deeply comforting about that sight. It reminded him that even as the day ended, God's care did not end. Even as the village grew quiet, the Lord remained near. Thomas set the pail down beside the rain barrel and listened. There were many small sounds in the village, but none of them felt hurried. The rain tapped softly on the roof tiles. Water trickled from the eaves into the barrel below. Somewhere down the lane, a wooden shutter closed with a gentle creak. Farther away, a cow shifted in its stall, and the faint voice of Mrs. Whitaker, the baker's wife, could be heard calling her children inside before the rain grew heavier. A lantern glowed in the window of the baker's cottage, warm and golden, and for a moment, Thomas could almost smell the bread that had been baked earlier that afternoon. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for another quiet evening." It was not a formal prayer. It was only a soft breath of gratitude, the kind that rose naturally from a peaceful heart. He had not had a perfect day. There had been small troubles, as there always were. A chair leg he was repairing had cracked in the wrong place. The garden gate had stuck in the mud. His boots were damp, and his shoulders were tired from carrying firewood. But now, as the rain settled over the village, and the evening folded itself around the cottages, even those little troubles seemed to become lighter. They did not disappear all at once, but they grew smaller in the presence of peace. Thomas stepped back inside and left the door slightly open, just enough to hear the rain. The cottage was small, with a stone hearth, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a shelf of worn books, and a simple bed near the far wall covered with a clean wool blanket. A small Bible rested beside the candle on the table, its cover softened from years of use. Beside it was a folded cloth, a cup, and a piece of bread wrapped carefully for supper. The room held the quiet warmth of a place where many ordinary prayers had been spoken. Prayers before meals, prayers in the morning, prayers when someone was ill, prayers when the harvest was uncertain, prayers of thanks, prayers of patience, and prayers so simple they were little more than a tired soul resting in God's hands. The rain continued outside, steady and kind. Thomas moved slowly around the room, hanging his coat near the fire, placing his damp boots by the door, and adding a small piece of wood to the hearth. The flames stirred, stretched, and glowed softly, sending a warm orange light across the walls. Shadows moved gently over the floorboards, and the whole cottage seemed to breathe with comfort. It was the kind of evening that invited quiet thoughts, the kind of night when a person could sit by the window and remember that they were not alone in the world. Across the village, other homes were settling into the same peaceful rhythm. In the baker's cottage, bread was being covered for morning. In the shepherd's home, wool blankets were being folded near the fire. At the edge of the lane, old Mr. Elias was closing the door to a small workshop after a day of carving wooden bowls. The rain touched every roof the same way, gently and without hurry. It fell on the churchyard path, on the stone wall, on the fields beyond the village, and on the quiet road that led into the hills. It seemed to wrap the whole village in one soft sound, as though God had placed a calm hand over the valley and whispered, "Rest now, my children. The day has done enough." Thomas sat near the open door with his hands folded loosely in his lap. He watched the candlelight tremble on the table and listened as the rain softened the edges of the evening. A peaceful tiredness settled over him, not heavy or sad, but gentle and welcome. He thought of the many little blessings he might have missed if he had been moving too quickly. The robin that had perched on the fence that morning, the child who had waved at him from the bakery steps, the scent of wet leaves, the comfort of a roof, the kindness of neighbors, and the quiet promise that God was present in all of it. Outside, the church bell gave one slow sound for the evening hour. It traveled softly through the rain, over the gardens and rooftops, through open windows and down narrow lanes, until it faded into the hush of the village. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound settle in his heart. The night had begun, and it had begun gently. The rain was still falling. The candle was still glowing. The village was safe and still beneath the watchful care of God. And in that peaceful little cottage, with the door open just enough to hear the rain, Thomas breathed deeply, gave thanks once more, and allowed the calm of the evening to rest upon him like a blessing. Thomas remained seated for a little while longer, simply listening to the rain as it moved across the village in a calm and steady rhythm. It was not the kind of rain that made anyone afraid to be alone. It was the kind of rain that made a small cottage feel even warmer, a candle feel even brighter, and a simple meal feel like a gift placed gently into waiting hands. Outside, the path beyond the door had grown dark and shining, each small stone catching a faint reflection from the windows of nearby homes. The garden leaves trembled now and then when a drop gathered at their tips and fell into the soil below. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell ropes swayed slightly in the damp evening air, though the bell itself had become still. Everything seemed to be resting. Everything seemed to be breathing slowly. At last, Thomas rose from his chair and moved toward the table. He did not hurry. There was no need to hurry on an evening like this. The day had already given what it needed to give, and the night had arrived with a softness that asked only for quietness and gratitude. He took the small loaf of bread from its cloth and set it near the hearth to warm. It was a round loaf from Mrs. Whitaker's bakery, golden at the edges and dusted lightly with flour. Earlier that afternoon, she had handed it to him with a kind smile, telling him it was from the first batch of the day and would be good with a little butter once the evening turned cool. Thomas had thanked her then, but now, as the scent of the bread began to rise in the warmth of the fire, he felt thankful all over again. He placed a small bowl on the table, then a piece of cheese, a spoonful of honey, and a little cup of milk. It was a very simple supper, but it looked peaceful beneath the candlelight. The candle stood in the center of the table, its flame small but steady, making a soft circle of gold on the worn wood. The table had scratches and marks from many years of use. Some had come from tools, some from meals, some from winter evenings when Thomas had sat there repairing a neighbor's stool or sharpening a small garden knife. To someone else, it might have looked plain, but to Thomas, it was a table filled with memory. It had held bread when food was plentiful and broth when food was little. It had held folded hands, quiet prayers, letters from friends, wildflowers in summer, and apples in autumn. It had held the ordinary life God had given him, and tonight, that was enough. Thomas cut the bread slowly. The crust made a gentle sound beneath the knife, and steam rose faintly from the soft inside. He spread a small amount of butter over one warm slice and watched it melt into the bread, shining in the candlelight. Outside, the rain continued to fall, tapping softly against the window and running in thin silver lines down the glass. The room smelled of bread, wood smoke, rain, and a little lavender that had been drying near the shelf. It was a humble room, but it felt full. Not full of noise, not full of busy thoughts, but full of quiet mercy. Full of shelter, full of the small, steady kindnesses that often go unnoticed during the brighter hours of the day. Before he began to eat, Thomas bowed his head. His prayer was gentle and simple, spoken just above a whisper. Lord, thank you for this bread, for this warm room, for the rain upon the fields, and for the peace you give at the close of the day. Bless this village tonight. Bless every home, every tired heart, and every person who needs rest. Amen. When he opened his eyes, the candle was still glowing, the rain was still whispering, and nothing outward had changed. Yet something inside him felt settled, as though his heart had found its place again. He ate slowly, with no rush to finish. Each bite of warm bread felt comforting, and each small sound in the cottage seemed to belong to the peacefulness of the night. The fire shifted in the hearth. A raindrop slid from the roof and landed in the barrel outside with a soft, hollow note. A wooden beam creaked as the cottage settled into the coolness of evening. Thomas thought about how many blessings came quietly. Some blessings arrived with laughter and celebration, but many came like this: a candle that did not go out, a roof that kept out the rain, a loaf of bread shared by a neighbor, a fire warm enough for one small room, a night without hurry, and the gentle knowledge that God was near. As he ate, Thomas remembered the morning. It had begun with pale light spreading across the fields and a breeze moving through the hedges. He had woken early, as he often did, and opened the door to find dew on the grass and sparrows hopping near the fence. The village had been just beginning to stir. Mr. Elias had crossed the lane with a bundle of wood beneath one arm. Mrs. Whitaker had opened the bakery shutters, and the first scent of bread had drifted out into the square. A small child had chased a brown hen around a puddle left from the previous night, laughing so brightly that even the old shepherd had smiled. It had been an ordinary morning, but now, looking back from the warm shelter of evening, Thomas could see how tender it had been. He had spent most of the day repairing a chair for a widow named Mrs. Jenner Bell, who lived near the churchyard wall. The chair was old, and one leg had become weak from years of use. Thomas had carried it back to his workshop and worked carefully, smoothing the wood, fixing the joint, and strengthening it with a small piece of oak. It was not difficult work, but it required patience. More than once, the wood had refused to sit correctly, and Thomas had paused, taken a slow breath, and begun again. There had been a time, years ago, when small delays made him restless. But age, faith, and many quiet evenings had taught him that not everything needed to be forced. Some things needed time, like bread rising beneath a cloth, like rain soaking into dry ground, like the heart learning to trust. When the chair was finished, he had carried it back through the village, and Mrs. Bell had received it with both hands pressed to her heart. She had thanked him more than the work deserved, or so Thomas thought, but her gratitude had been sincere, and as he walked home, he had felt again that God often used small things to comfort his people. A repaired chair, a shared loaf, a candle in the window, a kind word given at the right moment. None of these seemed grand, yet each one could be a quiet doorway through which peace entered. Thomas took another sip of milk and looked toward the small Bible beside the candle. He did not open it yet. Sometimes, simply seeing it there brought him comfort. Its pages had been turned by tired hands and hopeful hands, by hands that trembled with sorrow and hands that rested in gratitude. It had been with him through winters when the woodpile was low, through summers when the fields were bright, through mornings of work and nights of prayer. He had read from it at the bedside of the sick, at the table before meals, and sometimes outside beneath the apple tree when the air was warm. Tonight, it lay closed, But the words he had carried in his heart all day seemed to breathe gently in the room. Peace, mercy, rest, grace, love. The rain grew a little stronger for a moment, then softened again. It moved over the roof like a hand smoothing a blanket. Thomas looked toward the window and saw the candle reflected in the dark glass, as though another small flame were glowing outside in the rain. Beyond it, the village lights were dim and scattered. One lamp shone from the baker's home, another from the shepherd's cottage, another from the little house near the well. Each light was a quiet sign of life, a small vintage that someone was safe inside. Someone was eating supper. Someone was folding clothes. Someone was closing the day with a prayer or a sigh or a grateful thought they might not even know how to speak. For a while, Thomas let his thoughts rest on the people of the village. He thought of Mr. Elias, whose hands were rough from carving wood, but whose voice was always gentle when he spoke to children. He thought of Mrs. Whitaker, who rose before dawn to bake bread for others and still found time to ask each neighbor how they were feeling. He thought of the young shepherd boy who sometimes worried he was not strong enough for his work, though he was kinder and more faithful than he realized. He thought of Mrs. Bell, sitting again in her repaired chair, perhaps warming her feet near the fire. And as he thought of them, Thomas felt the quiet beauty of belonging to a place where people noticed one another, where small burdens were shared, and where the love of God was often shown not through grand words, but through patient hands. He finished the bread and brushed a few crumbs carefully into his palm. He did not like wasting even small things. The crumbs would be saved for the birds in the morning, if the rain had passed by then. He covered the remaining bread and set it near the shelf. Then he washed his cup and bowl in a basin of warm water, moving slowly, hearing the soft splash of water mingle with the sound of rain outside. Even this small task felt restful. The candlelight touched the basin, the spoon, the folded cloth, the edge of the table. The cottage was not silent, but every sound was gentle enough for sleep. When the table was cleared, Thomas took the candle and carried it to the window. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the lane. The rain had turned the path into a dark ribbon, and the puddles held the soft glow of windows. The church stood quietly in the mist, its white walls dim beneath the clouds, its steeple pointing upward into the rainy night. Thomas loved that little church, not because it was grand, for it was not grand at all, but because it had held the prayers of the village for many years. It had heard hymns sung softly in winter, scripture read in spring, wedding vows spoken in summer, and whispered prayers carried through autumn evenings. It had stood through rain and sun, through planting and harvest, through joy and grief, always reminding the village that God was faithful in every season. Thomas placed one hand lightly against the window frame. "Keep us close tonight, Lord," he whispered. The words were simple, but they carried all that was in his heart. Keep the old and the young. Keep the lonely and the tired. Keep those who are thankful and those who are too weary to feel thankful. Keep the fields, the animals, the travelers on the road, and every quiet home under this rain. Let this village rest beneath your peace. A soft knock of wind moved against the cottage, and the candle flame leaned slightly, then stood upright again. Thomas smiled at it, as though it were a small companion in the night. Then he returned the candle to the table and added another small log to the fire. The flame accepted it slowly, glowing brighter for a moment before settling down into a steady warmth. The room seemed ready for the deeper part of evening now. Supper was finished, the dishes were clean, the bread was covered. The rain was still falling. And in Thomas's heart, gratitude had become quiet and deep, like water gathered in a still well. He sat once more at the table, not to work and not to read just yet, but simply to be still. This, too, felt like prayer. Not every prayer needed many words. Sometimes prayer was a peaceful silence shared with God. Sometimes it was a tired hand resting beside a candle. Sometimes it was the choice to notice what was good, even after a long day. Thomas breathed in slowly and let the warmth of the cottage settle around him. He felt the softness of the hour, the nearness of the Lord, the kindness of a meal, the blessing of rain, and the steady comfort of knowing that, for tonight, there was nothing more he needed to carry. The day had been placed gently into God's hands. The night had opened like a quiet shelter. And beneath the sound of rain over the small Christian village, Thomas rested in gratitude, peaceful and unhurried, as candlelight glowed softly across the table. For a long while, Thomas remained at the table, his hands resting near the candle, his thoughts moving slowly and gently, like the rain sliding down the window glass. The cottage was warm now, and the fire had settled into a steady glow. Outside, the village had grown darker, but not lonely. The windows of the nearby homes still shone faintly through the rain, each one small and golden against the mist. The whole village seemed wrapped in a quiet blanket of evening, and Thomas felt that he could have stayed there for the rest of the night. Breathing slowly, listening, and letting his heart grow still. But just as he began to reach for the Bible beside the candle, he heard something beyond the open door. It was not loud. It was only the faint sound of footsteps on the wet path, followed by a gentle rustling, as though someone were trying to carry something carefully through the rain. Thomas turned his head and listened. For a moment, there was only the steady sound of water dripping from the roof into the barrel. Then he heard the footsteps again, slow and uneven, coming from the direction of the village well. He stood, took the candle from the table, and walked to the doorway. The cool scent of rain met him at once. He looked out into the dim lane, where the puddles held faint reflections of the cottage lights. At first, he saw only the moving curtain of rain. Then, near the bend in the path, he noticed a small figure carrying a covered basket in both arms. It was Hannah, the young woman who lived with her grandmother near the churchyard wall. Her shawl was pulled over her head, and she was walking carefully, trying to keep the basket dry beneath the edge of the cloth. Thomas set the candle safely inside and took his lantern from a hook by the door. He lit it from the candle flame, then stepped outside beneath the little roof. "Hannah," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Is that you?" The young woman looked up, and even through the rain, Thomas could see her relieved smile. "Good evening, Mr. Thomas," she answered. "I am sorry to be out so late. Grandmother needed broth, and Mrs. Whitaker sent some from the bakery kitchen. I thought I could carry it home before the rain grew heavier." Thomas stepped into the lane, holding the lantern low so the light would shine on the path before her. "That is a kind errand," he said gently, "but the stones are slippery tonight. Let me walk with you." "Oh, you need not trouble yourself," Hannah replied, though her voice held the tiredness of someone who would be grateful for help. "It is only a short way. A short way can still feel long in the rain," Thomas said with a small smile. "And besides, I have been sitting by the fire long enough. A little walk will do me good." He took his coat from the peg, pulled it around his shoulders, and stepped out fully into the evening. The rain touched his face and hands, cool and soft, not unpleasant. It made the village smell fresh and clean, like wet earth, stone, and wood smoke. He walked beside Hannah, holding the lantern slightly ahead of them so she could see where the path dipped near the old garden wall. The light moved gently over the wet stones, over the small puddles, and over the low flowers that grew along the lane, their petals bowed under silver drops of rain. Hannah carried the basket close to her chest, careful not to spill the warm broth inside. Steam rose faintly from beneath the cloth whenever the wind lifted one edge. For a few moments, they walked in peaceful silence. The rain made conversation unnecessary. It filled the spaces between words in a comforting way. The village seemed different at night, softened by water and shadow. The bakery windows glowed behind them, and somewhere inside, Mrs. Whitaker was likely cleaning the last flour from her hands before sitting down with her family. The blacksmith's shed was dark, but the smell of cooled iron still lingered in the damp air. Near the well, a bucket swung slightly from its rope, moving in the breeze with a small wooden sound. Beyond the lane, the church stood quiet and watchful, its white walls dim through the mist. "How is your grandmother tonight?" Thomas asked after a while. She is resting, Hannah said. She was tired this afternoon, but she smiled when I told her the rain had come. She said the sound of rain always reminds her that God knows how to refresh the earth. Thomas nodded slowly. That sounds like something she would say. She also said she hoped the rain would help everyone sleep well. It may do just that, Thomas replied. There is something merciful in a gentle rain. It asks the world to slow down. Hannah looked toward the churchyard wall ahead of them. I think she will be glad for the broth. Mrs. Whitaker added herbs and a little barley. She said it would warm her well. That was kind of Mrs. Whitaker, Thomas said. And kind of you to carry it. Hannah lowered her eyes slightly, as though kindness was not something she wished to be praised for. Grandmother has cared for me all my life. Carrying a basket through rain is a small thing, Thomas smiled, and they continued along the lane. A small thing, he thought. People often said that a small thing, a small loaf of bread, a small visit, a small candle in the window, a small prayer before sleep, and yet, in the hands of God, small things had a way of becoming more than they appeared. A single candle could make a room feel less lonely. A warm bowl of broth could comfort an aching body. A gentle walk beside someone in the rain could remind a heart that it had not been forgotten. As they neared the churchyard wall, the rain grew a little steadier, and Thomas lifted the lantern higher. A thin stream of water crossed the path ahead, running from the hillside toward the lower gardens. It was not deep, but the stones there were slick, and Hannah paused. Without making a fuss, Thomas stepped forward first, testing the ground with his boot. Then he offered his arm. Hannah accepted it carefully, and together they crossed the wet stones. The basket remained steady in her arms. On the other side, she let out a small breath of relief and laughed softly. Thank you, she said. I might have spilled half of it. And then your grandmother would have received broth with rainwater added, Thomas said gently. Though perhaps she would still have given thanks for it. Hannah smiled. She probably would. They reached the little cottage near the churchyard wall. It was one of the oldest homes in the village, with a low roof, a narrow garden, and a small window where a lamp glowed warmly behind a thin curtain. The rain ran from the eaves in steady threads. A clay pot of mint sat by the door, and the scent rose fresh and sweet in the damp air. Hannah knocked softly, then pushed the door open. Warm light spilled out onto the path. From inside came the faint sound of a fire and the gentle voice of her grandmother. Is that you, child? Yes, grandmother, Hannah called. And Mr. Thomas walked with me so the basket would not spill. Thomas remained at the doorway, not wanting to bring too much rain inside. But Hannah's grandmother, Mrs. Grace, called out at once. Do not leave him standing in the wet. Come in for a moment, Thomas. A kindness should not be sent away too quickly. Thomas smiled and stepped just inside, wiping his boots carefully on the mat. The cottage was smaller than his own, but it was warm and peaceful. A fire burned low in the hearth, and a patchwork blanket lay across Mrs. Grace's knees as she sat in her chair near the window. Her hair was silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes were gentle and bright. Hannah placed the basket on the table and uncovered the broth. The steam rose into the room, carrying the scent of herbs, barley, and warm vegetables. That smells like a blessing, Mrs. Grace said softly. It came from Mrs. Whitaker, Hannah told her. And Mr. Thomas helped me over the stones. Mrs. Grace looked at Thomas with gratitude. Then the Lord has sent me 2 blessings in one basket. Thomas shook his head gently. Only one basket, Mrs. Grace. I merely carried a lantern. A lantern on a rainy night is no small gift, she said. You, of all people, should know that. Thomas did not argue. He only smiled, because he knew she was right. Hannah poured the broth into a bowl, and Mrs. Grace held it carefully with both hands, letting the warmth rise toward her face. For a moment, no one spoke. The rain tapped softly against the window, and the fire whispered in the hearth. Thomas stood near the door, his coat damp at the shoulders, feeling the quiet peace of the little room. There was nothing grand happening there, no great announcement, no important gathering. No event anyone would speak of years later. Only an old woman receiving warm broth, a young woman resting from her errand, and a neighbor holding a lantern in the rain. Yet the room felt full of grace. Mrs. Grace took a small sip and closed her eyes. "Very good," she whispered. "Very good indeed. May God bless her hands." "I will tell her," Hannah said. "And may God bless yours too, child," Mrs. Grace added. "And yours, Thomas." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Thank you." Mrs. Grace looked toward the window, where rain slid down the glass in shining lines. "When I was young," she said quietly, "I used to think blessings were always large things. A great harvest, a healed sickness, a long journey safely completed. And those are blessings, certainly. But now that I am old, I think I notice the little ones more. A bowl of broth, dry socks, a warm lamp, a friend at the door, the sound of rain when one is safe inside." She opened her eyes and smiled. God is very kind in small ways. If Thomas felt those words settle gently in his heart. God is very kind in small ways. It was something he had always believed, but hearing it spoken in that little cottage, while rain touched the window and steam rose from the bowl, made it feel new again. He thought of his own supper, the bread, the candle, the warmth of the fire. He thought of the village lights shining through mist. He thought of the many people who had quietly cared for one another that day, without calling attention to themselves. Perhaps much of faith looked like this, he thought. Not loud, not hurried, not heavy with many words, but steady and humble, like a lamp kept burning for whoever might need its light. After a little while, Thomas turned to go. "I should return before my fire forgets me," he said softly. Hannah thanked him again, and Mrs. Grace lifted one hand from beneath the blanket. "Walk gently, Thomas, and may the Lord give you peaceful rest tonight." "And you as well," he replied. "May this rain bring comfort." He stepped back into the night, closing the door carefully behind him. The lane was darker now, but his lantern glowed warmly in his hand. As he began the walk home, the rain seemed even softer than before. It fell on his coat, on the churchyard wall, on the mint by Mrs. Grace's door, and on the quiet stones beneath his feet. He did not feel cold. The kindness he had witnessed in that little cottage warmed him more deeply than the fire. It was a warmth that did not come from the hearth, but from remembering that God's love often traveled through ordinary people, through simple errands, through hands willing to help, through neighbors who noticed when someone was tired. The village slept more deeply now. Most of the windows had dimmed, though here and there a lantern still burned. Thomas passed the church and paused for a moment beneath the shelter of the gate. The wooden door was closed, but he could see the shape of the cross above it, dark against the gray sky. Rain gathered along the roof and fell in gentle streams onto the stones below. He looked up and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for the kindness that keeps a village warm." Then he continued home. His cottage waited at the end of the lane, its window glowing faintly from the candle he had left on the table. The sight filled him with quiet comfort. He opened the door, stepped inside, and felt the warmth of the room welcome him back. The fire had not gone out. The bread was still covered. The candle still burned with its small, faithful flame. Thomas hung his damp coat by the hearth, set the lantern on the table, and stood for a moment in the stillness. Outside, the rain whispered on. Inside, the cottage was peaceful, and in Thomas's heart, the small act of walking beside someone in the rain became part of the evening's blessing. It asked nothing from him now. It only rested there, gentle and bright, like the lantern light still shining softly across the table. After Thomas returned to his cottage, the evening seemed even quieter than before. The small act of walking Hannah home had left a gentle warmth in his heart, the kind of warmth that stays with a person after a kind word, a shared meal, or a simple moment of grace. He stood beside the hearth for a while, letting the fire dry the dampness from his coat and sleeves. The rain still moved over the roof in a steady hush, and the window glass shimmered softly with the reflection of candlelight. His cottage felt welcoming, and for a moment he thought he might sit down again, open the worn Bible beside the candle, and spend the rest of the evening in stillness. But just as he reached for the chair, he heard another sound drifting through the rain. It was not footsteps this time. It was music, very faint, almost hidden beneath the tapping of water on the eaves. A hymn was being sung somewhere near the center of the village. Thomas paused and listened. The sound came softly, carried by the mist and the wet evening air. It was not loud enough to fill the whole lane, but it was clear enough for him to know where it came from. The little church. On rainy evenings, especially when the day had been long and the villagers had no urgent work left to do, a few people sometimes gathered there for a short time of quiet singing. It was never a formal service, never heavy or hurried. No one was expected to come, no one counted who was missing. It was simply a peaceful habit the village had grown into over the years, like lighting a candle at dusk or giving thanks before bread. Someone would open the church door, someone would light the lamps, and whoever wished to come would sit for a little while in the warmth of shared silence, soft hymns, and gentle prayer. Thomas stood by the table, listening as the hymn rose and faded with the rain. He knew the melody well. It was one the village had sung for many years, a simple hymn about the Lord's peace resting over the weary at day's end. He did not need to go. The cottage was warm, and the night was wet. But something in the softness of the music invited him gently, not with pressure, but with peace. He took the lantern again, checked that the fire was safe, and wrapped his coat around his shoulders. Then he stepped back outside into the rainy lane, closing the cottage door carefully behind him. The village path glistened beneath the lantern light. Rainwater ran in small streams beside the stones, and the gardens on either side of the lane looked dark and fresh, their leaves bowed under silver drops. The air smelled of wet earth, chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of flowers closing for the night. Thomas walked slowly, allowing his steps to match the quiet rhythm of the rain. He passed the baker's cottage, where the front window still glowed warmly. He passed Mr. Elias's workshop, now dark except for a small lamp near the door. He passed the village well, where the wooden bucket hung still in the rain. And then the lane opened toward the little square where the church stood. The church was small, with whitewashed walls, a modest wooden door, and a steeple that rose gently above the rooftops. It was not grand like the stone churches in larger towns, and its bell was not deep or powerful. But to Thomas, and to many in the village, it was beautiful because it belonged to them. It had stood through many seasons of village life. It had watched over weddings and baptisms, harvest prayers and winter hymns, quiet funerals and joyful spring mornings. Its walls had heard the trembling voices of the worried and the peaceful voices of the grateful. Tonight, in the rain, it glowed like a lantern in the mist. Warm light spilled from the windows in soft golden shapes, falling across the wet grass and the stone path. The rain made the light appear gentle and blurred, as though heaven itself had softened the edges of the world. Thomas paused near the gate before entering. He looked up at the cross above the church door, dark and steady against the cloudy sky. Rain gathered along its wooden edges and fell in tiny drops. For a moment, he simply stood there, not asking for anything, not trying to make his thoughts perfect, only resting in the quiet nearness of God. Then he opened the gate, walked up the path, and stepped inside. The church was warm with lamplight. A few candles burned near the front, their flames small and steady. The wooden pews glowed softly in the golden light, and the windows were dark with rain. Only a handful of villagers had gathered. Mrs. Whitaker sat near the aisle, her hands folded in her lap, her flour-dusted apron still tied around her waist. Mr. Elias sat toward the back, his hat resting beside him. The young shepherd boy, Samuel, stood near the front with his hands clasped shyly, singing in a quiet voice. Hannah was there too, having returned from her grandmother's cottage, her shawl damp at the edges, but her face peaceful. No one looked surprised to see Thomas. They only smiled softly, as people do when someone comes in from the rain and finds a place among friends. Thomas slipped into a pew near the middle. The hymn continued, gentle and slow. The villagers did not sing loudly, and not every voice was perfectly in tune, but the sound was comforting. It filled the little church the way warm light fills a room at evening, not overwhelming, not demanding attention, but resting quietly in every corner. Thomas opened the small hymn book in front of him, though he hardly needed the words. He joined softly, letting his voice blend with the others. The rain tapped against the windows as they sang, and the sound became part of the hymn, a quiet accompaniment given by the night itself. When the hymn ended, no one rushed to speak. The silence that followed was peaceful, not empty, the kind of silence that feels held. Mrs. Whitaker bowed her head, and after a moment she offered a simple prayer. She thanked the Lord for the rain, for the bread that had risen well that morning, for the safety of the village, and for the comfort of neighbors who cared for one another. She asked for rest for the tired, warmth for the lonely, and peace for anyone whose heart felt heavy. Her words were plain and gentle. They did not try to explain everything. They simply placed the village, with all its small needs and quiet hopes, into the hands of God. Thomas kept his head bowed as she prayed. He thought of Mrs. Grace, holding the warm bowl of broth. He thought of Hannah, walking carefully through the rain. He thought of the old repaired chair by the hearth, the covered bread on his own shelf, the candle waiting in his cottage, and the many lights scattered across the village. None of these things seemed separate anymore. They were all woven together into the same soft evening, like threads in a blanket. Work, kindness, food, rain, prayer, rest. Ordinary things, yet touched by grace. After the prayer, Mr. de Vere, Elias rose slowly and read a short passage from the Bible. His voice was low and calm, shaped by age and years of quiet work. He read only a few lines about peace, rest, and the Lord's care. Then he closed the book and sat down again. There was no long sermon, no heavy instruction, no need for many words. The villagers simply let the scripture settle over them, the way rain settles over a field. Thomas liked that. Sometimes a small portion of truth was enough for the night. Enough to remind a tired heart that it was safe. Enough to remind a worried mind that it did not need to carry tomorrow before tomorrow arrived. Enough to remind every soul in the little church that God's kindness was not far away, but near, steady, and gentle. Another hymn began, even softer than the first. This one was familiar too, a lullaby-like melody often sung in the village at the end of gatherings. The words spoke of evening shadows, of a lamp kept burning, of the Lord watching over his children through the night. Thomas sang quietly, and as he did, his eyes moved around the church. He noticed the smooth places on the pews where many hands had rested. He noticed the old wooden floor, worn by years of footsteps. He noticed the vase of wildflowers near the front, gathered earlier that day before the rain began. Their petals were slightly drooping now, but still lovely. He noticed the candlelight on Hannah's face, the peaceful tiredness in Mrs. Whitaker's eyes, and the way young Samuel stood a little straighter when the others sang with him. Metal sights filled Thomas with tenderness. The rain outside grew softer, then steadier again, then soft once more. It seemed to breathe with the village. No one in the church seemed troubled by it. In fact, the rain made the little gathering feel even more sheltered. Beyond the church walls, the world was wet and dark, but inside there was warmth, song, and quiet fellowship. Thomas felt again that God's peace was often found not in removing every cloud, but in giving light within the clouds. Not in making every path dry, but in walking with his people along the rainy road. Not in making every life grand, but in filling humble rooms and small churches with grace. When the hymn ended, the villagers sat quietly for a final moment. Then, one by one, they began to rise. There was no hurry. Mrs. Whitaker spoke softly with Hannah near the door. Mr. Elias placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder and told him he had sung well. Samuel looked down, shy but pleased. Thomas remained seated a little longer, watching the candles near the front. Their flames leaned now and then in the faint movement of air, but they did not go out. He thought of how much comfort could come from such small lights. A candle in a cottage, a lantern in the rain, a lamp in a church window, a quiet faith in a human heart. At last, Thomas stood and walked toward the door. Mrs. Whitaker smiled at him. "A good night for singing softly," she said. "A good night for remembering peace," Thomas replied. She nodded. "And for warm bread in the morning, Lord willing." Thomas smiled. "That too." Hannah passed by with her shawl pulled close. "Grandmother is resting now," she told him. The broth warmed her well. "I am glad," Thomas said. "Tell her I remembered what she said," Hannah smiled. "That God is kind in small ways?" "Yes," Thomas said, "especially tonight." Soon the villagers stepped out beneath the church porch, each one lifting a lantern or pulling a shawl closer against the rain. They did not scatter quickly. For a few moments, they stood together under the shelter, listening to the rain fall from the roof. The square was quiet, the cottages dim, the road shining faintly beneath the cloudy sky. Then they began to make their way home, one by one, their lanterns moving like little stars through the mist. Thomas was the last to leave the churchyard gate. He turned back once more to look at the glowing windows. The singing had ended, but the warmth of it seemed to remain. The little church stood patiently in the rain, holding the prayers of the evening within its walls. Thomas felt no need to say anything. His heart was already praying in silence. "Thank you for this place. Thank you for these people. Thank you for the peace that comes quietly. Thank you for being near in rain, in candlelight, in bread, in kindness, and in rest." Then he turned toward home. The lane was quiet, and the rain whispered over the village as gently as before. Behind him, the church light glowed in the mist. Ahead of him, his cottage waited with its small fire and covered bread. Thomas walked slowly, his lantern swinging softly at his side, feeling that the whole village had been tucked beneath a blessing. The night was deepening now, but it was not empty. It was filled with the gentle presence of God, the comfort of shared song, and the calm promise that even the smallest village, on the rainiest night, could rest safely in the Lord's care. Thomas walked slowly away from the little church, carrying the quiet warmth of the hymns with him as he stepped back onto the rain-darkened lane. The church door had closed gently behind him, and the soft golden light from its windows now rested on the wet stones like a blessing left behind. The village square was almost empty. Only a few lanterns moved in the mist as the others made their way home, each light drifting carefully along a familiar path. The rain continued to fall, not heavily, but steadily, with a calm rhythm that seemed to cover every sound with tenderness. It touched the roof of the church, the wooden gate, the low stone wall, the sleeping gardens, and the narrow road that led from one humble cottage to another. Thomas held his lantern near his side and let its glow guide his steps, though he knew the path well. He had walked it in morning sunshine, in winter frost, in the golden light of harvest, and now in the soft silver rain of evening. The hymn they had sung still lingered in his mind. He did not sing it aloud, but the melody moved quietly within him, as though his heart remembered it without needing words. The song had been simple, speaking of evening rest and the Lord's faithful care, yet it seemed to fit the night perfectly. Thomas looked up through the rain and saw the shape of the clouds moving slowly above the village rooftops. There were no stars yet, only a deep gray sky softened by mist, but he felt no sadness in that. Some nights were bright with moonlight, and some nights were wrapped in rain. Both could be gifts. Both could carry peace. Tonight, the sky seemed to say that even when the stars were hidden, they had not vanished. And even when a person could not see far ahead, God's care remained near enough for the next step. As Thomas passed the churchyard wall, he noticed how the rain had gathered on the leaves of the ivy that climbed along the stones. Each leaf held a tiny drop of water, and each drop reflected the lantern light for one brief moment as he walked by. It was a small beauty, almost too small to notice, but Thomas noticed it. He had learned over the years that peace often entered through the smallest door. A quiet sound, a kind face, a warm meal, a candle shining at the right hour, a soft word spoken without hurry. The world could be full of such little mercies if a person moved slowly enough to see them. The lane curved past Mrs. Grace's cottage, where the lamp in the window had grown dimmer. Hannah must have lowered the flame so her grandmother could rest. Thomas paused a moment outside the gate, not to disturb them, only to listen. From within the cottage, there was no sound except the faint crackle of the fire and the rain against the roof. The bowl of broth had likely been set aside now, the blanket tucked more closely around tired knees. The room settled into the gentle silence that comes after care has been given. Thomas felt thankful. He remembered Mrs. Grace's words again. God is very kind in small ways. The words seemed to belong to the rain itself. Every drop on the roof, every lamp in every window, every neighbor safely home, seemed to repeat them in a softer voice. He continued walking. The path sloped gently downward toward the well, where water shimmered in the puddles around the stone base. The old bucket hung from its rope, dark with rain, and the wooden handle gleamed in the lantern light. In the daytime, the well was a place of voices and work. Women filled pails there. Children leaned too close and were gently called back. Men paused beside it on their way to the fields. News was shared there, and sometimes laughter rose from that little circle of stone. But tonight, the well was still. Its quietness did not feel empty. It felt like rest. Even the places of work were resting now. Even the tools, the gates, the baskets, and the fields seemed to be lying down beneath God's peaceful hand. Thomas thought of his own workbench at home, where the half-finished chair legs still waited beneath a cloth. Earlier in the day, the cracked wood had frustrated him, but now it seemed far less important. It would be there in the morning. He would return to it with patience. The rain reminded him that not everything needed to be finished before sleep. Some things could remain unfinished and still be safe. Some concerns could be laid down for the night and picked up again tomorrow with a calmer heart. The Lord did not ask his children to carry every task into the darkness. Night was given for rest, just as morning was given for beginning again. A small breeze moved through the lane, carrying the scent of wet grass and distant wood smoke. Thomas pulled his coat a little closer, though he was not cold. The rain had dampened his sleeves and touched the edges of his hair, but he felt peaceful. Ahead, the bakery stood at the corner of the square, its windows dim now, though one lamp still burned in the back room. Through the rain, he could see the outline of stacked baskets near the door, and the sign above the window moving slightly in the wind. By dawn, Mrs. Whitaker would rise again, knead dough with strong hands, and fill the village with the warm scent of bread. For tonight, though, the ovens were quiet. The flour had been swept from the floor. The loaves had been covered. The family was likely resting upstairs, safe beneath the rain. Thomas passed the bakery and whispered a quiet blessing for them. Not as a formal prayer, but as a gentle thought turned toward God. Bless their home tonight. Give them good rest. Let tomorrow's bread rise well. It was a small prayer, and perhaps no one but the Lord would ever know it had been spoken. That was enough. Many of the best prayers, Thomas thought, were like seeds placed quietly in the soil. They did not need to be seen to matter. Farther down the lane, Mr. Elias's workshop stood beneath the shadow of an old chestnut tree. A few curls of pale wood still rested near the doorstep, damp now from the rain. Thomas slowed as he passed. He imagined the old craftsman sitting earlier that day with a piece of wood in his hands, turning it slowly, seeing in it the shape of a bowl before anyone else could. There was something prayerful in that kind of work, to take what was rough and shape it with patience. to smooth what was splintered, to make something useful, something that could hold soup, fruit, water, or flowers. Thomas smiled softly. Perhaps the Lord worked gently in human hearts in a similar way, not with haste or harshness, but with steady hands, shaping, smoothing, and making room for grace. The rain became lighter for a few moments, almost like mist. Thomas looked toward the fields beyond the last row of cottages. In the dark, the fields were only wide shapes beneath the cloudy sky, but he knew them well. Wheat grew there in summer. In spring, the grass shone bright and new. In autumn, the earth smelled rich and full after harvest. Tonight, the rain was sinking into the soil, preparing it for days Thomas could not yet see. That thought comforted him. So much of life was hidden preparation. A seed beneath the ground. Bread rising beneath a cloth. A prayer spoken in a quiet room. A tired heart learning to trust while no one else noticed. God was present in hidden places too. Near the lower path, a small sheep had wandered close to the fence and was standing under the shelter of a tree, its wool damp at the edges, but its body safe behind the rails. Thomas stopped and looked at it for a moment. The sheep lifted its head, blinked slowly in the lantern light, then returned to stillness. Somewhere nearby, the shepherd's dog gave one soft bark from inside the barn, then grew quiet again. Thomas smiled. The animals knew how to rest when the night came. They did not ask the rain to stop. They did not worry about morning. They accepted shelter and stillness. Thomas wondered how much lighter human hearts might feel if they could receive the night in the same way. He turned toward his cottage lane. The path here was narrower, bordered by low lavender bushes and a small row of stones he had placed years ago to keep the garden soil from washing away in the rain. His cottage window glowed ahead, faint and golden. Seeing it filled him with a deep and simple comfort. There was no grand welcome waiting there, no feast, no music, no bright company. Only a small fire, a covered loaf of bread, a clean cup, a worn Bible, and a bed with a wool blanket. Yet tonight, those things felt more than enough. They felt like grace arranged quietly in a room. Before going inside, Thomas paused at the garden gate. The rain had gathered on the leaves of the rosemary and lavender, and the earth smelled fresh and alive. His beans leaned gently against their poles. The chickens were quiet in their coop, their soft shapes barely visible through the wooden slats. The rain barrel was nearly full now, and water dripped from the roof into it with a slow, hollow music. Thomas placed his hand on the gate and looked back once more toward the village. From where he stood, he could see only a few lights. One near the church, one at Mrs. Grace's window, one near the bakery, and perhaps one more far up the lane where the shepherd lived. Most of the village had settled into darkness, but it was a peaceful darkness, held beneath the sound of rain. Thomas bowed his head slightly. He did not speak many words. He simply stood there in the wet garden air and let his heart become quiet before God. Thank you, Lord, for bringing us through another day. Thank you for shelter, for kindness, for neighbors, for rain, for light in the windows, and for the peace that waits for us when we slow down enough to receive it. The prayer rose within him gently and then rested. He did not need to add more. When he opened the cottage door, warmth greeted him like an old friend. The fire was low but alive, glowing red beneath a small arch of ash. The candle on the table had burned down a little, but its flame was steady. The room smelled of wood smoke, warm bread, and rain carried in on his coat. Thomas stepped inside, closed the door softly, and set the lantern on the table. For a moment, he stood without moving, listening to the difference between outside and inside. Outside, rain whispered over the roof and garden. Inside, the fire breathed quietly. The candle flickered, and the cottage held stillness. He removed his coat and hung it near the hearth. Then he knelt to stir the fire gently, adding one small piece of wood so it would keep the room warm a little longer. The flame rose, then settled. Shadows moved across the walls like soft waves. Thomas sat in the chair by the table and looked around the room with a grateful heart. Nothing had changed while he was away, and yet everything seemed more precious. Perhaps kindness had a way of opening the eyes. Perhaps prayer did too. The bread was still covered. The Bible still waited. The bed stood ready in the corner. The rain still sang its quiet song. Thomas reached for the Bible and rested his hand on its worn cover. But he did not open it immediately. He simply felt the softness of the leather beneath his palm and let the peace of the rainy walk settle fully into him. He thought of the church glowing in the mist, of the villagers singing in low voices, of Hannah's careful steps, of Mrs. Grace's thankful smile, of the sheep resting by the fence, and of the hidden fields drinking in the rain. All of it seemed to tell the same gentle truth. God's care was not far away. It was near, woven through the ordinary hours, present on the wet road, present in the warm kitchen, present in the quiet church, present in the small cottage at the end of the lane. At last, Thomas opened the Bible and read only a few lines, softly, not because he needed many words, but because he wanted to end the evening with his heart turned toward the one who had kept him through the day. The words were peaceful, and he let them rest in him without trying to think too much. Then he closed the book, folded his hands, and breathed deeply. The rainy path home had become more than a walk. It had become a slow reminder that he was guided, sheltered, and held. Not hurried. Not forgotten. Not alone. Outside, the rain continued to fall over the small Christian village. It touched every roof, every field, every quiet lane. It filled the night with a sound so gentle that even tired thoughts could begin to loosen and drift away. Thomas sat beside the candle, safe in the warmth of his cottage, and felt the peaceful care of God surrounding him like the softest blanket. The day was nearly done. The village was resting, and the night, with all its rain and stillness, had become a gift. The night settled over the small Christian village with a quietness that felt tender and complete. It did not arrive all at once, but little by little, like a soft blanket being drawn over a sleeping child. The rain continued to fall, lighter now than before, touching the rooftops, the garden stones, the church windows, and the dark fields beyond the last cottages. In Thomas's little home, the candle burned low on the wooden table, and the fire in the hearth had become a bed of glowing embers, with one small flame still rising now and then from the edge of the wood. The room was warm, and the shadows were gentle. Nothing in the cottage asked to be hurried. Nothing demanded attention. The bread was covered, the cup was clean. The Bible was closed, but near. The day, with all its small tasks and quiet blessings, had come to rest. Thomas sat for a while without speaking, letting his eyes move slowly around the room. He noticed the way the candlelight rested on the table, the way the folded cloth lay neatly beside the basin, the way his coat hung near the fire with drops of rain still shining along the hem. He listened to the rain on the roof and to the faint sound of water gathering in the barrel outside. Every sound seemed softened by the hour. Even the little creaks of the cottage walls felt comforting, as though the old beams were settling into sleep too. Thomas breathed slowly and felt the peace of the evening move deeper within him. There had been work today. There had been tiredness. There had been small frustrations, small needs, small acts of care. But now, all of it seemed held in a gentle stillness. He did not need to sort through every thought. He did not need to finish every task. He only needed to receive the night as a gift from God. Across the village, other homes were also growing still. In the baker's cottage, Mrs. Whitaker had finished washing the last bowl and had set the flour sack neatly near the table for morning. The ovens were cooling, and the scent of bread still lingered in the warm air. Her children, who had laughed earlier in the day near the bakery steps, were now tucked beneath quilts, their breathing slow and even. Near the hearth, Mr. Whitaker closed his eyes for a moment, not quite asleep, but peaceful enough that sleep would soon come. On the shelf beside the door, tomorrow's baskets waited, empty and clean. The rain touched the bakery roof and slid down the window glass. and the whole house seemed to rest in the quiet promise that morning would come in its own time, with dough to knead, bread to bake, and enough grace for another day. Near the churchyard wall, Mrs. Grace's cottage had grown dim. Hannah had lowered the lamp and placed the empty bowl beside the basin, the last warmth of the broth still remembered in the room. Mrs. Grace slept in her chair for a little while before Hannah gently helped her to bed. The old woman's silver hair lay softly against the pillow, and her hands, which had worked and prayed through so many years, rested loosely over the blanket. Hannah stood near the window for a moment and listened to the rain. She could see the faint shape of the church through the mist, its windows dark now, its door closed, its bell silent. Yet the peace of the little gathering still seemed to linger in the air. Hannah whispered a quiet thank you to the Lord, not because the day had been easy in every way, but because kindness had met them within it. Then she pulled the curtain, placed another small piece of wood on the fire, and let the cottage become still. Farther along the lane, old Mr. Elias sat beside his workbench with a single lamp burning low. He had meant only to put away his tools, but the sound of rain had made him slow and thoughtful. A half-carved wooden bowl rested beneath his hands. He ran his thumb gently along the smooth curve he had shaped that afternoon, feeling where the wood still needed softening. He smiled to himself. It could wait until morning. Not every rough edge had to be smoothed tonight. He wrapped the bowl in a cloth, placed his tools in their proper places, and stood carefully, his knees a little stiff from the long day. Before putting out the lamp, he looked around the workshop with quiet gratitude. Wood shavings lay in a small pile near the bench. Finished bowls were stacked on the shelf. The smell of cedar and rain drifted together in the air. "Thank you for useful hands," he murmured softly. Then he closed the workshop door and went into the warmth of his home. At the edge of the village, the shepherd's barn was dark and peaceful. The sheep had settled close together, their wool damp only at the edges, their bodies warm in the shelter. The shepherd's dog lay near the door with one ear lifted, listening to the rain and to the slow breathing of the animals. Young Samuel, who had sung shyly in the church earlier, lay awake for a little while in the loft above the barn, watching the rain move down the small square window. He thought about the hymn and about Mr. Elias telling him he had sung well. The memory made his heart feel steady and glad. Sometimes he worried that his voice was too small, or that he was too young to be useful. But tonight, he felt that even a small voice could bring comfort when it was offered with sincerity. He closed his eyes, and the rain became like a lullaby above him. Thomas did not know all these small moments were happening across the village, but he could imagine them. He had lived there long enough to know the shape of his neighbors' evenings. He could imagine the bakery growing quiet, Mrs. Grace resting, Mr. Elias putting away his tools, Samuel listening to the rain near the sheep. The thought comforted him. The village was not made peaceful by one person alone. It was peaceful because each home carried its own little lamp of faithfulness. One person baked bread. One person repaired chairs. One person cared for an elder. One person watched the flock. One person carved wood. Envelop sang softly in the church. And over all of them, God's care rested quietly, not always seen, not always spoken of, but present like the rain nourishing the hidden roots beneath the soil. The rain softened even more. It no longer tapped quickly against the window, but whispered there in long, gentle breaths. Thomas rose from his chair and began to prepare the cottage for sleep. He moved slowly, as though each small action were part of the calm rhythm of the night. He checked the latch on the door, not with fear, but with the simple comfort of making a home ready for rest. He folded the cloth on the table, placed the Bible carefully on the shelf beside the bed, and covered the embers in the hearth so the fire would remain safe and warm. He poured a little water into a cup and set it nearby for the morning. Then he stood at the window and looked out into the garden. The beans, rosemary, and lavender were dark shapes beneath the rain. The chickens slept in their coop. The full rain barrel reflected a faint blur of candlelight from the cottage window. Beyond the garden, the village lights were almost gone now, one by one dimmed for sleep. Thomas placed his hand lightly on the window frame. There was something holy, he thought, about a village at rest. Not holy in a grand or distant way, but holy in the gentle way of ordinary life placed in God's hands. People slept after working. Children dreamed after laughter. Old hands rested after service. Tired hearts grew quiet after prayer. Even the fields rested, drinking in the rain beneath the darkness, preparing silently for growth no one could yet see. Thomas felt no need to ask for signs or wonders. Tonight, the wonder was already here, hidden in peace, in shelter, in the sound of rain, in the calm knowledge that the Lord cared for every small life beneath these rooftops. He turned from the window and prepared for bed. The bed stood near the far wall, simple and clean, with a wool blanket folded across it and a small pillow that had softened with years of use. Thomas sat on the edge and removed his shoes, setting them neatly beside the bed. His body was tired now in a gentle way. The walk through the rain, the hymns, the warm cottage, the slow supper, the quiet thoughts, all of it had led him toward rest. He could feel sleep beginning to approach, not suddenly, but like a friend walking slowly up the path. He pulled the blanket back, then paused and looked once more at the candle. Its flame was small now, leaning slightly in the still air, but it continued to shine. Thomas smiled. A small light was enough for a small room. A small prayer was enough for a tired heart. A small blessing was enough to remind a person that God was near. Before lying down, Thomas took one more slow breath and let the day pass through his memory without holding on to it too tightly. Morning dew on the grass. The chair repaired for Mrs. Bell, warm bread from the bakery, rain beginning over the garden, Hannah walking carefully with the basket, Mrs. Grace smiling over the bowl of broth, the church glowing in the mist, the villagers singing softly, the lantern light on the wet path, the sheep resting by the fence, the cottage waiting warm at the end of the lane. Each memory came softly and then drifted away, leaving only gratitude behind. There was no need to keep replaying the day. It had been lived, it had been received. It could now be entrusted back to the Lord. Outside, the village seemed to exhale into sleep. The last lamp near the bakery dimmed. The last movement in Mrs. Grace's cottage became still. The shepherd's dog lowered its head. The church stood quiet in the rain, its bell silent until morning. The fields beyond the village lay dark and peaceful, and the road into the hills disappeared beneath the mist. Above the clouds, hidden from sight, the moon continued its quiet journey. The stars were there too, though no one in the village could see them tonight. Thomas thought of that as he lowered the candle flame. There were many good things a person could not always see. Stars behind clouds, seeds beneath soil, grace within ordinary days, God's care within silence. The room grew darker, but not empty. The embers in the hearth glowed faintly, and the window held the soft gray shimmer of the rainy night. Thomas lay down and pulled the blanket over himself. The wool was warm against his shoulders, and the pillow felt cool and familiar beneath his head. He turned slightly toward the window so he could hear the rain more clearly. It fell with such patience, such gentleness, that his breathing soon began to follow it, in and out, soft and slow. The rain on the roof, the fire in the hearth, the village at rest, the Lord near in the stillness. Thomas did not try to force himself to sleep. He simply allowed rest to come. He let his hands relax. He let his shoulders loosen. He let the small worries of tomorrow remain outside the door, where they could wait until morning. There would be time enough for work when the sun returned, time enough to mend what needed mending, to help where help was needed, to give thanks again for bread, rain, neighbors, and grace. But tonight was not for carrying tomorrow. Tonight was for resting beneath the mercy of God. Tonight was for remembering that the village was safe, the rain was gentle, the heart could be quiet, and the soul could lie down in peace. And so the night deepened over the small Christian village. Rain whispered over every roof. The little church stood in the mist like a faithful memory of prayer. The gardens drank quietly. The animals slept. The cottages glowed faintly, then faded into darkness. And in his small room at the edge of the lane, Thomas rested beneath his blanket, held by the warmth of the hearth, the hush of the rain, and the peaceful care of the Lord. The day had ended softly. The village was sleeping, and all was gathered, gently and safely, into God's quiet keeping. The rain continued softly through the night, gentle and steady, like a quiet song meant only for sleeping hearts. Thomas lay beneath his warm wool blanket, facing the small window where the darkness shimmered faintly with moving drops of rain. The fire in the hearth had settled low, no longer bright, but still alive enough to give the room a soft breath of warmth. Every now and then, one ember glowed a little deeper, then faded again into a peaceful red. The cottage was nearly dark now, yet it did not feel empty. It felt sheltered. It felt held. The table, the chair, the covered bread, the closed Bible, the hanging coat, and the clean cup for morning were all resting quietly in their places, as though the whole room had joined the village in sleep. Thomas listened to the rain and allowed his breathing to slow. There was nothing more he needed to do. The door was latched. The fire was safe. The village was still. And the day had been gently placed into God's hands. He thought again, only briefly, of the people he loved in that small valley. Mrs. Whitaker, resting after the long work of baking bread. Hannah, sleeping near her grandmother's room. Mrs. Grace, warm beneath her blanket. Mr. Elias, with his tools put away. Young Samuel, near the sheep, perhaps dreaming of hymns and lantern light. He did not need to see them to feel thankful for them. Their quiet homes seemed gathered together beneath the same rain, beneath the same mercy, beneath the same patient care of the Lord. Outside, the wet garden gave off the clean scent of rosemary, lavender, and soft earth. The rain barrel was full now, and the water from the roof fell into it with slower, deeper notes. The village paths were dark and shining. The church stood in the mist, its bell silent, its windows dark, its cross lifted quietly into the night. The fields beyond the village were drinking in the rain, hidden beneath the darkness, preparing in silence for green mornings that would come later. Thomas found comfort in that thought. So many blessings began unseen. Seeds were hidden before they grew. Bread rose under a cloth before it was shared. Prayers were whispered before peace was felt. Grace often worked quietly, gently, and faithfully, long before anyone noticed. His eyes grew heavy, but before sleep fully came, Thomas folded his hands beneath the blanket. He did not sit up. He did not light the candle again. There was no need. A bedtime prayer could be spoken in the dark, with rain for music and the warmth of the blanket around tired shoulders. His voice was barely more than a whisper, soft enough that it seemed to become part of the night itself. Dear Lord, thank you for this quiet day and for this gentle night. Thank you for the rain that rests upon the rooftops, for the fields that receive it, for the gardens that will wake refreshed in the morning, and for every small blessing that came to us today. Thank you for warm bread, for candlelight, for a safe home, for kind neighbors, and for the peace that can be found even in the simplest evening. Thank you for walking with us in ordinary moments, when we are working, when we are tired, when we are helping one another, and when we are finally still. The rain brushed softly against the window, and Thomas paused for a breath before continuing. Lord, please bless this village tonight. Bless every home beneath this rain. Bless the old and the young, the strong and the weary, those who are peaceful and those who still need peace. Bless anyone who feels lonely, and remind them gently that they are seen and loved. Bless anyone who is worried about tomorrow, and help them lay tomorrow down for now. Bless every tired heart with rest, every quiet room with comfort, and every sleeping child with safety. Let your kindness be near, like a lamp in the window, like a hand over the shoulder, like a soft voice saying, You may rest now. The cottage was still quiet. The embers glowed faintly. Thomas felt the words settling over him, not as something heavy, but as something warm and light. Forgive us for the moments today when we were impatient, distracted, or afraid. Wash our hearts gently as the rain washes the dust from the leaves. Help us receive your mercy without fear. Help us remember that we are loved, not because we have done everything perfectly, but because your love is generous and kind. Let this night be a place of peace. Let every burden grow quiet. Let every anxious thought loosen and drift away. Keep us close to you as we sleep. His voice softened even more. And when morning comes, Lord, let us wake slowly and gratefully. Let us notice the blessings that are waiting in small places. The first light at the window, the smell of bread, the sound of birds, the faces of those we love, and the work you place gently before us. But for now, help us rest. Help us be still. Help us trust that while we sleep, you remain awake in love. Thomas breathed in slowly, then let the breath go. Into your hands, we place this day. Into your peace, we place this night. Watch over this village. Watch over every listener who hears these words. Let them feel safe. Let them feel forgiven. Let them feel held in your gentle care. And let sleep come softly, like rain on a quiet roof. Amen. After the prayer, Thomas did not move. He simply rested, his hands relaxed, his eyes closed, his heart quiet. The rain went on whispering. The little cottage remained warm. The village slept beneath the mist. And somewhere beyond the clouds, though unseen, the moon and stars continued to shine. Thomas did not need to see them. It was enough to know they were there, just as it was enough to know that God's love remained near, steady and faithful, even in the deepest part of the night. His thoughts grew slower. The sound of rain became softer and farther away, like a lullaby carried over the hills. The memory of the day faded into peace. Warm bread, candlelight, a lantern in the rain, a glowing church, kind voices, wet garden leaves, and the quiet road home. All of it rested now. All of it was safe. And as Thomas drifted gently towards sleep, the small Christian village lay peaceful beneath the rain, wrapped in darkness, warmed by grace, and kept through the night in the loving hands of God.